So that's all we've got in terms of all of us trying to like check our glucose and become really metabolically healthy. All we've got really is, okay, if I'm below 100 in the morning, I'm okay. And if I'm after a huge carb-rich meal under 140 after 2 hours, I'm fine. I would argue that these are drastically too lenient. And if that's what we're focusing on and orienting around, people will not achieve optimal health.
All right, keto campers, I am so excited to geek out with you with the brilliant health practitioner, Dr. Casey Means. Dr. Casey Means, a Stanford-trained physician turned digital health entrepreneur. She's the co-founder of Levels Health, which is a startup focusing on maximizing diet and exercise through continuous blood glucose monitoring. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. How to use a CGM machine, continuous glucose monitor, to see what foods are working for you, which keto foods are working for you or not. So without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Casey Means. Hey, Dr. Casey.
Hey, Ben. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. We were just having an offline discussion and geeking out a little bit. So I'm glad that I'm grateful to connect with you. Thank you for joining me today.
You as well. Thank you so much for having me on.
So how does a surgeon go from being a surgeon and being in that conventional space to doing what you're doing today?
Great question. So it was a big transition out of the operating room to the functional medicine world and then ultimately the digital health world. And it honestly really started way back when I was a college student. So it was kind of a long journey. I'll give you kind of the Cliff Notes version, but basically, I started college at Stanford right after the Human Genome Project had wrapped up, and digital therapeutics and direct-to-consumer genetic testing was really coming online. The personalized health revolution was really starting, and it was very, very exciting. And so that was sort of the ecosystem with which I entered the biomedical sciences and sort of the very beginnings of my healthcare career. And with all this sort of stuff in the water about the Human Genome Project and 23andMe and personalized genetics, there really was this overarching sense to me that healthcare is really about humans being this unique biochemically individual blueprint, our genes. But the difference between the expression of health or disease really has to do with how those genes are actually expressed. And that variable that controls that comes down to exposures, and that is diet and lifestyle. So it's what we're eating, it's what we're thinking, how we're stressing, how we're sleeping, how we're moving, what environmental toxins we're exposed to. And all those things go into our body as molecular information that tells our genes what to do. So in that sense, it's really an empowering view of human health, because even though we are born with this genome, which is, this written code that we can't do a whole lot about, the expression of that is very much we have a lot of control over that. And then since that time, a lot more has come out about that sort of modifiable aspect of genetics through the whole epigenetics revolution, which is how the genome is folded. And we know that certain genes can essentially fold on themselves and make it more difficult for them to be expressed, but through epigenetics and histone modification, and that our behaviors, our diet, our lifestyle, the way we manage stress, all these things have a huge impact on epigenetics and the folding of the genome. So it's really interesting. So that was kind of what I started in my health career, being embedded in. And I worked at 23andMe, and I was a teaching assistant for a pharmacogenomics class. And I, just really loved that. And so then flash forward, I go to medical school. And medical school is actually a very different approach than this. The way that conventional medicine is sort of taught and practiced is kind of much more of a pattern recognition process. So the way it works is you go in and you see a patient and you ask them a bunch of questions and you get lab tests and you do an exam. And those end up becoming this collection of signs and symptoms. Signs being objective findings like lab tests and exam findings and imaging, and symptoms being more subjective things that you learned about the patient. And the way medicine works is, you say, okay, this patient's got this collection of signs and this collection of symptoms. And if it adds up, you basically get to label a diagnosis on it. And a diagnosis is like a label, a term that encompasses the collection of signs and symptoms. And then as a doctor, you can kind of turn around and you can look at your book of which medicines and which surgeries essentially are used to treat that diagnosis. And so in that sense, it's quite reflexive. It's very much about pattern recognition. And it doesn't really take into account on the day-to-day practice a lot of these modifiable aspects of health and disease. So this is very kind of interesting because now in our country, we're dealing with this chronic disease epidemic. We're dealing with, 88% of Americans having insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction, 74% of Americans being overweight or obese, 128 million Americans having prediabetes or diabetes. These are just a couple of the massive amount of chronic disease that we're seeing and that are touching almost every American. And we know that these diseases are rooted directly in dietary and lifestyle choices over the years. And yet, not necessarily something that's really factoring into our day-to-day practice or the nuances of our practice. And the average medical student only gets about 4 hours of nutrition training in their entire medical school career, even though nutrition is arguably the highest value, lowest hanging fruit intervention for really reversing disease. So that was kind of medical school and some observations I had there, and then moved on and went into the surgical world. And so I trained in residency as a head and neck surgeon, which is an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And, I was really given the realities of the healthcare system that I was seeing, as this young, sprightly, 26-year-old was thinking like, well, what is my goal? I want to help people. I want to make people well. And surgery seemed to me to be this, within the confines of the system, like the most efficient way to do that. Because you take someone to the operating room, they have pus in their sinus. And at the end of the day, you've punched a hole in the sinus, you've sucked the pus out, and that you've, quote unquote, fixed them. And so that felt really appealing to me as someone who wanted to do good for patients. And so practicing surgery for 4 or 5 years. And ultimately I kind of was stepping back and saying, almost every condition I'm treating in the operating room here as an ear, nose, and throat doctor is fundamentally an inflammatory condition. So sinusitis is inflammation of the sinuses. When the nasal tissue gets inflamed, it kind of closes the hole that drains the sinuses, and then pus builds up. I was treating tons of chronic ear disease, like middle ear infections that kids are always getting. And that fundamentally is the tube that drains the ear into the nose. The eustachian tube gets inflammation, clogs up, you get pus build up in the ear, and then you punch a hole in the eardrum and you put an ear tube in, you suck the pus out, and that's fixing it. And I was seeing a lot of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is really rising in rates, especially in women in our country. And this is inflammation of the thyroid. It's an autoimmune attack of the thyroid. And then I was also seeing a lot of cancer, which we're more and more understanding as an inflammatory and disease. We're seeing a lot of therapies come online that actually harness the immune system to actually fight cancers, like cancer vaccines. So it's fundamentally a problem with how the immune system is responding to these abnormal cells in the body. And then lastly, I've seen tons of like vocal cord granulomas and masses on the vocal cords that lead to hoarseness and breathing problems. And these are ultimately inflammatory masses. So I'm sitting there saying, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. Everything's inflammatory, prescribing a lot of steroids, which are anti-inflammatory medications, doing a lot of surgery. But it seems a little illogical that I would use surgery, which is like a mechanical, physical tool, to fix what is fundamentally like a complex physiologic problem that is ultimately related to how the immune system is sensing threat in the body. Inflammation fundamentally is the immune system saying there is a threat and we have to activate in order to fight that threat. So it became very imperative to me to think, what is this threat and why is everyone inflamed? And this was just in my little ENT world, but looking more broadly across chronic disease, a lot of chronic diseases we're facing are fundamentally inflammatory in nature. Obesity, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, et cetera. And so became very, very important to me to think more about that issue. And that led me really on a journey that kind of led directly to diet and lifestyle. These are the things, the choices we're making in terms of what we put in our body, what we expose our selves to day to day, ultimately are I think, triggering a lot of the chronic inflammation that we're seeing. Our bodies are exposed to whole new breeds of foods that our bodies throughout history were really never meant to be exposed to. Refined and processed grains, refined and processed sugars, processed vegetable oils that are highly oxidized, all these things that you can imagine go into the body. Your body hasn't seen these things in these quantities ever throughout human history. And so the immune system's like, whoa, threat. This is not good. Same is true of environmental chemicals, environmental toxins, and pollutants. There's a class of compound called POPs, which are persistent organic pollutants, which are all over our environment and cause metabolic dysfunction and inflammation. Then we've got chronic sleep deprivation. We're sleeping way less than we used to, which is to the body is registered as threat. That the body's like, why are you not sleeping? This is not, something must be wrong. And so it activates. And then you've got sedentary behavior, which triggers the immune system. And we've got chronic low-grade stressors. Every time you get an email or a ping on your phone, the body's like, ooh, what's happening? Maybe little threat. So our bodies, our poor mitochondria are just like, there is so much going on. And I think we're very activated from our immune system. And anyways, ultimately decided, okay, if I really want to get to the root cause of some of these ENT conditions, I really need to be helping patients reverse this inflammation and kind of really get fundamentally healthy. So ultimately got additional training in functional medicine through the Institute for Functional Medicine, learned a lot about this root cause approach to healthcare. And instead of thinking about things as these sort of separate entities in the body, like, oh, these are ear, nose, and throat conditions, and these are metabolic conditions, and these are heart conditions, and these are GI conditions, instead thinking about what's the physiology that actually links a lot of these diseases. And so that really led me down the road of really trying to understand metabolic dysfunction, because when you look at how diseases are connected in the body, especially our major chronic diseases, it really leads you right back to metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance, which are also drivers of inflammation. And so opened up a private practice, a functional medicine practice, where I was really trying to help people understand these root causes, really trying to optimize metabolic function for my patients. Started putting continuous glucose monitors on a lot of patients to help them have real-time clarity into how food and lifestyle choices were affecting their glucose levels in real time, which I found to be a really interesting and engaging sort of behavior change tool for people. And then, so did that for a while and realized, okay, so ultimately for me to make a real impact on patients' lives, like people really have to be every single day making consistent choices that improve their health. They have to be making good choices in relation to food, exercise, sleep, stress, exposures. And so really this comes down to inspiring people to make good choices and make behavior change choices every single day. And to me, that really lends well to digital health solutions, because we have our phones on us every single day. We don't have our doctors with us every single day. And so in order to make sustainable, choices, and we make hundreds, if not thousands of choices every day about all these different things, to have a tool with you that can kind of help you make those choices in a smart way for your body, I thought was really where we needed to go. And doctors really need to be adopting and engaging with technologies so that patients can make those sustainable choices that ultimately lead to the expression of health and essentially functional physiology. And so that's how I kind of moved from surgery to ultimately functional medicine and metabolic focus, and then really started doing more in the digital health world, realizing that, doctors have to engage in this if we want to scale our efforts to help the most people and have the most effective impact on behavior change.
Yeah, what a journey you've had so far. I love that you recognize that you were being reactive and then you became now proactive. And I always give that analogy of the whack-a-mole game at the arcade, where a mole pops up and a symptom, whatever it is. So you perform surgery or you give a pill or even a supplement, and then another mole pops up and you do the same thing. And shouldn't we be asking, why are these moles popping up? And that's what you said. Why are these moles popping up? And it's metabolic dysfunction. It's inflammation. All roads lead to inflammation, and there's different roads that are stem from inflammation, but inflammation is linked to just about every single disease out there. So I acknowledge you, Casey, for seeing that and then also making that pivot, which I imagine, and maybe you could share, how difficult was it for you to actually make that pivot, because you were in this conventional world and now you're looking and thinking outside of the box, and you might have had some peers that might have not have liked that. So how was that pivot for you?
Yeah, it was, by the time I ultimately made the decision to sort of put my scalpel down and leave the operating room, it actually was a really easy decision, because ultimately I had taken a lot of time to reflect on, like, what is my North Star? What is my purpose here as a physician? And my purpose is to help the most people as I possibly can achieve true, real foundational health and to thrive and to maximize their human potential. And when it became clear to me, I mean, it honestly comes down to a spreadsheet. It's like, I could invest my time in a tool, a digital health tool that has the power to meaningfully impact millions of people through principles that I've thought a lot about and that are well established in the research, or I could continue helping, 20 to 30 patients a week in my functional medicine private practice. And, which is very, very useful. But ultimately, a lot of the principles are very foundational and can be scaled if we merge that clinical insight with digital tools. And so that was kind of, and from moving away from surgery, the same thing was true. My North Star was to help people foundationally get healthy and thrive. And I think surgery can absolutely help do that in acute situations where people have an acute injury, like breaking a bone or getting in a car accident, and you need to fix something and get them back on track. But for chronic conditions that are based in inflammation, I don't see surgery playing a role like it does today, where it is something we're very quick to engage in. And so I just, once I had that philosophical shift, it was really not that difficult to shift gears. And a big part of this was really getting involved in the network and systems biology movement and really diving into that research. I don't think that's a term that many people are familiar with, but ultimately I think this really is going to be the future of medicine. And what this is exactly what you were talking about with the whack-a-mole. So right now we see all diseases as isolated silos. We see depression as its unique disease, obesity, benign prostatic hypertrophy and prostate cancer, hypertension, diabetes. These are all separate things that we see as silos. And then, let's say IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, totally separate. No one would really think they're the same thing. And so, and we treat them as such. We have a different medication for each of those diseases. But in network biology, because of the proteomics revolution and whole genome sequencing, we now can understand what are the common core pathways and genetic upregulation and physiology that actually links all of these into a web as opposed to silos. It is so much more efficient to treat the links between diseases where one intervention can have multifarious effects versus playing whack-a-mole, like you said, with all these different diseases, which is really a never-ending cycle because you're not actually reversing physiology, you're just managing symptoms. And so from an efficiency standpoint, from, rational biochemistry perspective, treating those links is where I think the future of medicine needs to go, especially with the huge challenges we're facing right now. And I think I just finished Ben Bickman's new book, and Why We Get Sick. And I think he does probably the best job of describing this network of diseases of anyone I've ever seen, because he really talks about how that link between so many of the things we're seeing today that seem so disparate, skin tags, infertility, erectile dysfunction, hypertension, heart failure, cancer, seem different, but actually fundamentally this is a problem of insulin resistance. And so that's the web that links these things. And so I think once you've kind of wrapped your head around that and really believe it based on, a lot of late nights reading research literature, and like it's not that hard to walk away, because ultimately you just believe a different, you're moving in a different direction of how you want to help people. And certainly don't regret any of my time there, because it led me to understand this problem in a way that gives me really that fire to want to approach it a little bit differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does. So let's talk about why you decided to go. I mean, you kind of just explained it. All roads are kind of leading to inflammation, insulin resistance, and high glucose levels. So you developed a software, you co-founded Levels, and you utilize a CGM, which is a continuous glucose monitor. So for somebody listening or watching here on YouTube, and they have no idea what a CGM is, this is the first time they've ever heard about it. Could you explain what it is?
Absolutely. Yeah. So a continuous glucose monitor is this tiny little quarter-sized wearable sensor that you stick to the back of your upper arm, and it's got a tiny little hair-like filament that goes under the skin. And that little filament is actually checking your glucose every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day. And you wear this sensor just like you would wear a Fitbit that measures your heart rate, and it's transmitting a glucose value to your phone every 15 minutes without you having to do really anything. And so what you end up with is this incredible biometric data of what's going on inside your body and your response to food continuously. What's really cool about glucose is that it changes rapidly after an input. So you eat and your glucose, if it's going to change, it's likely going to change within like 30 minutes to an hour. So you're getting this really closed loop, like one-to-one feedback between what you're eating and what's happening to your blood glucose. So this is a technology that has been around for actually a while, like over a decade, and it's FDA approved for management of type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So right now it's got a clinical use for these populations and has been a game changer because formerly these individuals were pricking their fingers, 3 to 5 times a day after meals to see what's happening, and mostly from, medication management. And this tool allowed them to stop having to prick their fingers and is just a lot more comfortable. It's completely painless, and it's just such a more robust data stream. But what's interesting about metabolic disease is that these are insulin resistance and metabolic disease. These are diseases that don't just turn on like a light switch when you get a diagnosis of diabetes. These are diseases that start decades before the actual diagnosis and are essentially the result of repeated, regular insults to your metabolic system through these hundreds of daily choices that we make every single day. So it became sort of like, well, how can we use this incredible technology that gives this data stream to help people far before their diagnosis refine their diets and lifestyles so that they never get to that stage. They never develop insulin resistance. And it's, you could say like, oh, well, why don't people just eat low carb, and then they won't get glucose spikes and then this will never happen. But, that unfortunately, we're at monumental proportions of this epidemic in terms of metabolic dysfunction. And I think people do really benefit from having tools that give them some accountability and clarity into what's going on and keep them on track. But what's most interesting is that no two people respond to carbs exactly the same. So there's tons of variability between how like you or I would respond to the exact same carb load. We could both eat a banana and I could go to a glucose level of 150 milligrams per deciliter and you could go to 90 milligrams per deciliter. And so a banana is probably a much better choice for you and much worse choice for me. I'm almost certainly going to secrete more insulin from my pancreas when I eat that banana. That insulin is going to be floating through my bloodstream. And if that happens repeatedly, is ultimately going to lead to my cells becoming possibly insulin resistant and lead me down the path towards something like type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. And so, because of that biochemical individuality, which is relatively a new concept, formerly we kind of thought like everyone responds the same. And that's why we have these indices like the glycemic index chart,
Right.
which basically says like, if you and I both eat a banana, we're going to have the same glycemic impact from that food. But more recent research, most notably out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel, which was published in Cell in 2015, which was called Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses. They put continuous glucose monitors on a huge population of healthy individuals and saw that basically people are all over the place with how they respond to a standardized carb load. And so for us to really stay on track in the face of a food culture that has a lot of glucose triggering foods, I think it's really important to have some more clarity and data into that. So,
yeah, it's super cool because I've been using one. You all sent me one a few weeks ago. I think I've been using it now for about almost 3 weeks, and it's been really awesome to see the data right when it happens, right? I've never used a CGM before. I've used, finger pricks, and I've seen kind of what happens, but I was not pricking my finger all day long. With this, I have the CGM. If you're watching on YouTube, I actually have it right here. Yeah, on the back of my shoulder here, or arm, I should say. And it's very simple. I mean, I just put my phone here and it'll give me a reading, and it's continuously monitoring. But I found that blackberries actually jacked up my blood sugars, right? And I would think, blackberries, they're low on that glycemic index, they're low in sugar for a fruit, but for me, I don't do well with it. I do much better with blueberries, right? So just knowing that data, I can understand that I'm going to have more blueberries and less blackberries. So I want to actually get some coaching from you, Casey, because I had a few different scenarios that I want to kind of get your feedback on when it came to monitoring my glucose via the continuous glucose monitor. Number one was, I remember I was in a fasted state, and typically my fasting glucose is in the 80s, mid 80s or so. And I finished up, doing some work, and I was going to go into a meeting, and I decided I wanted to break my fast. This is around 1 p.m. or 12:50 p.m. And I had about 4 ounces of sheep's milk yogurt, and I added some bone broth powder to it. So it was all protein, a little bit of some fat. And then I tested I tested this. I put my phone there, and I saw my reading, and it actually dropped my glucose from 88 to the lower 60s. It was like 61. So tell me what happened there.
That is very interesting. And how quickly did that happen?
30 minutes right after.
30 minutes, and you weren't doing any exercise or anything like that?
I was actually sitting right here at my desk on a call, and I just decided to do it in the middle of the call. And I was like, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this is a speculation. I'm going to speculate here. I don't know for sure, but it's so normal physiology. When glucose goes into the bloodstream, the pancreas is going to release insulin to basically tell the cells to take up glucose, to get it out of the bloodstream so that it can either be used by the mitochondria to generate cellular energy, ATP, or if there's excess, for it to be stored. And can be turned into either stored chains of glucose, which is called glycogen, which is like short-term energy storage, which goes into the liver or the muscles, or it can be converted into fat, like triglycerides, and then go into the fat cells to be stored for long-term energy storage. So that's kind of normal. But other things can stimulate insulin as well, like protein. And so protein to some extent does cause an insulin response. It tells your body you're in a fed state. And so that kind of transmits to the pancreas to release insulin, perhaps because there's an expectation of glucose coming or something like that. But perhaps what happened was that you ate this is essentially zero sugar food, the sheep's milk yogurt, and I don't know how much of the residual sugars there were in there, but I imagine very, very low. And then you added bone broth powder, which gives you extra protein, and probably some fat, I would imagine.
Yeah, I had a little bit of some fat, mostly protein. Yep.
Yeah. And so you may have had essentially no glucose come in, but straight protein come in and have a little bit of an insulin surge. So you actually took up some of your circulating glucose that was already in the bloodstream, which is very tightly controlled by the body. And that led to a little bit of a dip. And you didn't essentially replace it with any exogenous food-based glucose. So that's a possibility, kind of essentially an insulin response in the absence of glucose.
Yeah, that's kind of where my line of thinking was too. And I felt totally fine. I didn't feel hypoglycemic, but it was just interesting data. I wouldn't have expected that. Second thing that happened was I went to go work out in the fasted state, which I usually do. I work out and I train in the fasted state.
Nice.
And I started off my workout. Glucose was in, before I started my workout, I checked, my glucose was like in 94, I think it was. And then I did some warming up. I did some strength training, probably about 15 minutes of some weightlifting. And then my glucose went up. It went up to 108. And then halfway through the workout, I finished the strength training. And then I did some sprints on my rooftop here. And then it dropped down to like 82. So what happened there?
Yeah, this is so interesting. And I commend you for being in the fasted workout camp, because this is heretical to a lot of people who come from the carb loading philosophy of getting the most out of your workouts. But a lot of evidence to support that actually exercising in a fasted state is really good for the body and for our metabolic pathways. So what likely happened to you there with the weightlifting is that essentially, the body's fairly simple. When the body thinks that there's a threat or we are under stress and need energy to essentially run from something, like think, old days, the example of being chased by a lion.
Mm-hmm.
If you think that you need to essentially be run from a lion, your muscles are going to need very quick sugar to work. And so the body has this mechanism where if you think you're about to be chased by something and you need energy for your muscles, you're going to dump your stored glucose from your liver, which was stored as chains of glucose called glycogen. You're going to dump it out really fast and flood the bloodstream with that to feed your muscles. And so we often will see a glucose rise even in a fasted state, because even in a fasted state, you still have some stored glycogen in your liver, unless you've been fasting for a really long time, in which you can fully deplete your glycogen. We store about 2,000 calories of sugar, of glucose as glycogen. So you can imagine you could burn through that through an extended fast, but overnight, you're probably not going to burn through all of that. So you start lifting weights or you start a high intensity interval training workout, and that sends to your body the signal, oh man, we need sugar. We're about to run from something. This is a stressful situation. And your liver immediately basically dumps out a bunch of sugar. The muscles don't tend to need as much as what the liver dumps out. It overcompensates. And so that's why you see a rise. Then you'll often see a dip after that, because the muscles become very insulin sensitive during a workout. They're hungry for that glucose. They want it. And so you are essentially going to have maybe an exaggerated response of taking a lot of that up as the workout winds down. And you can see increased insulin sensitivity in the muscles immediately after a workout, and end up, in the days following. So that's kind of what was happening there.
So fascinating. It's really cool to just see that in real time, what's happening. And, the next thing is, what role does cortisol play here, right? Doesn't also cortisol have an effect? Because cortisol goes up, glucose tends to follow cortisol. So that also played into the role of me exercising in the fasted state, right?
That's exactly what happened. So that's the language with which the exercise told your liver to do that. So catecholamine release, cortisol release, those things are going to tell your body that it's time to dump some glucose. And so a couple other sort of interesting things there. One is the idea of stress and stress hormones. This is also another very important topic, which is that our perception of stress in our day-to-day lives has a huge impact on our glucose levels. So you can just have a stressful conversation or respond to a stressful email or, anything like that. And it can actually raise your glucose on its own. And we've seen this a lot, actually, just in our customers. And I've seen it in myself. I remember the first podcast I recorded ever, my glucose totally went up, fasted, recording it. And it was just oh, this is so interesting. This must have been a cortisol response. And I think there is, it's really good to be aware of that. And I think that's a really interesting part of this biofeedback aspect of CGM, because sometimes it's very difficult to know actually whether we're stressed or not. And I think a lot of us deny stress, but our bodies, you cannot hide stress from your body, even if your brain thinks that you're not stressed. And I have so many patients who say, oh, I'm never stressed, but stress from a physiological level, it's there in almost all of us. And so I think it's really neat to be able to actually almost have this accountability check of no, something was going on and there are things that we can do. What if, you could insert a little meditation into that part of your day when you know that you're getting a little glucose surge from stress, or do other tactics that are going to lower your overall cortisol response. And, something that we're exploring and are going to be developing is the integration of the CGM data stream with heart rate variability data streams. So heart rate variability is essentially looking at the beat to beat variability between our heartbeats. So you can check your heart rate, which is how many beats you have per minute, but then you can also look at how much time is in between each heartbeat. And actually when there's more variability between the beat to beat time, that's actually associated with a better stress response, more adaptable, more flexible. Flexibility in the body is typically always a good thing. Yes. And so high HRV is positive. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how HRV and these stress-related glucose responses correlate. And I think together could really help move people into more of a sense of somatic awareness and more body awareness about what's actually happening, especially for these subjective experiences like stress that are sometimes really hard to pin down and to know when they're happening. So
Yeah, awesome. Well said. It's super cool to just see this and talk about this. Okay, the next thing is this. The keto campers, they're checking their glucose, their ketones. I get a lot of messages. Hey, Ben, in the morning when I wake up, I had, my glucose is 105 or 98. Why is it so high in the morning? And then it kind of drops an hour later. And I explained to them it's something called the dawn phenomenon, and it's a natural occurrence. So explain what's happening there and how, and then we'll transition to what are the optimal ranges to look for.
Yeah, absolutely. So the dawn effect is this phenomenon that you can see where basically first thing in the morning, glucose just rises on its own, totally in a fasted state. And it can rise like 5 points, 20 points. And in people with metabolic diseases like type 1 or type 2 diabetes, it can be very, very high, like can go up 50 points. So the physiology behind this is that in order to wake up from sleep, our body releases cortisol and other hormones to essentially rouse us, to get us to wake up. And those are going to have an impact on the things we just talked about, on the liver and mobilizing glucose. Your body is preparing to need to be alert, stand up, use your muscles again. And so that's what's happening with the dawn effect. It's more pronounced in someone who has diabetes or insulin resistance, because if you are insulin resistant, then you're going to have more of this inability to get that glucose quickly into the cells. And so you're going to see more of that rise. The evidence suggests that a very healthy person with perfect metabolic health should probably not have much of a dawn effect at all. And the more dawn effect you have is actually probably more moving on that metabolic spectrum. So in someone who has perfect insulin sensitivity, the cortisol, and the stress hormones are going to release that glucose, but you're immediately going to compensate by taking that up into your cells. And so, so it's totally normal to not see a dawn effect and to just have it completely flatline in the morning, or like a 2 to 3 point raise when you wake up.
Awesome. So let's talk about what are the normal blood glucose ranges to be in fasting and then postprandial, and what are the optimal ranges?
Yeah, absolutely. So to talk about normal, this is really coming from, I'm going to put air quotes around normal, because this is what like the American Diabetic Association and sort of governing bodies, they've reviewed the literature and they've come up with these criteria for categories of what is normal as a way to categorize people and as a way to sort of efficiently group who is most likely, in certain categories. But I think it's important to remember before talking about these categories of like normal, pre-diabetic, and diabetic, that these are population-based statistics, and they tell you essentially at a population level what level of risk you're at for different things. And so they don't actually tell us what to shoot for. So in our current system right now, if you have a fasting glucose, meaning a glucose first thing in the morning after not having consumed any calories for 8 hours of below 100, you're considered normal metabolic health. If you are between 100 and 125, you're pre-diabetic. And if you're 126 milligrams per deciliter or above, you're considered diabetic. And then there's other tools that we use to diagnose people for these conditions. And so one is called an oral glucose tolerance test, where an individual will take either 50 or 75 grams of a glucose drink, usually called glucola. It's really gross. And you chug it. And then
Sounds nasty.
It is nasty. Yeah. And you'll check your finger prick glucose or your blood glucose from a vein 1 hour and 2 hours after that. And so if you go up, your glucose goes up after that glucose drink. And if after 2 hours you're below 140 milligrams per deciliter, you're considered non-diabetic. So that's sort of the lump for that. And then the third test is hemoglobin A1C, which is a blood test that looks at a 3-month average of blood glucose by looking at how much glucose is stuck to red blood cells. And if you're if you're below 5.7, you're considered normal. 5.7% of your blood cells having sugar attached to them, glycated hemoglobin. So that's all we've got in terms of all of us trying to like check our glucose and become really metabolically healthy. All we've got really is, okay, if I'm below 100 in the morning, I'm okay. And if I'm after a huge carb-rich meal under 140 after 2 hours, I'm fine. I would argue that these are drastically too lenient. And if that's what we're focusing on and orienting around, people will not achieve optimal health. Those are way, way too lax. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the research literature, even within the normal range, as you go up from, let's say, a fasting glucose in the 70s up to 99, which is still considered normal, risk of nearly all diseases increase. So there was one study done in the New England Journal of Medicine, which looked at healthy young men, and they were non-diabetic. So all of them had a fasting glucose less than 100. And they broke them up into quartiles of fasting glucose. The lowest quartile was somewhere between like 70 and 78, and then like 78 and 85, 85 and 92, 92 to 100. I don't think those ranges are exactly accurate, but it was like 4 quartiles within normal. And what they saw is that as fasting glucose increased throughout that range, risk of developing type 2 diabetes skyrocket. Huge increase in odds ratio. I think it was 8 in the highest quartile compared to the lowest. So you're much more likely to develop diabetes if you have a higher fasting glucose than a lower fasting glucose, even if your doctor says you're totally normal. You're normal. You're below 100. The same is true of stroke and heart disease. It's essentially that exponential increase in cardiovascular disease that happens with metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, does not start right at 100. It starts well below 100. So even if you're at, the mid 90s, you're still on that upward curve for developing those diseases. So I would argue, we need to be achieving the lowest quartile of these things. So I would say, based on my review of the literature, I would suggest a healthy fasting glucose to shoot for between 72 and 85. And that would, based on the data that I've looked at, be in the lower risk categories within the normal range for developing future disease. Then from a post-meal standpoint, and I say 72 is the lower limit for that and not 70, because there actually is some research that shows that the lower your fasting glucose is, risk for sort of mortality actually goes up. And I think this needs to be studied more, because I'm not fully convinced of this, because I think there are people who are on ketogenic diets who are getting very adequate fuel from other sources to their brain and to other parts of their body who may have a very, very low fasting glucose. And I'm not confident that that's associated with increased risk. But that needs to be studied. We need to better understand what's optimal for a non-diabetic person. But because of that research, I would put, for now, the lower limit that I would suggest is maybe 72. Not that you should eat to get maybe like higher, but just from the research we have now. So there needs to be more research done in this. For post-meal glucose levels, so right now all we've got is that we should shoot for less than 140 2 hours after a meal, which to me is crazy. There's about 6 or 7 studies that have taken healthy populations, put CGMs on them, and looked at what their 24-hour glucose levels are. So just totally observational studies. In those studies, the average healthy person spends 90% of their day between a glucose level of 70 and 120. So the vast majority of our day, we should probably be spending between 70 and 120. And if you look at even some of the studies that have more lenient sort of maybe not so healthy populations, but still technically non-diabetic. There's another study that showed that people spent 93% of the day between 70 and 140, but almost no one really ever goes above 140. So the idea that we should shoot for that after 2 hours of a meal just seems crazy to me. From my perspective, we should really never be going out of the 70 to 120 range. And I think we should probably be shooting for, pre-meal glucose levels somewhere in the 80s and 90s, just sort of resting glucose throughout the day, and maybe going up a maximum of 15 milligrams per deciliter after a meal. And the reason for this, really, it's not just about the glucose, but it's about the insulin. So every time you spike your glucose, you're going to release insulin from the pancreas. And when you do that to a high degree, a high glucose spike, high insulin spike, you are exposing all the cells in your body to this big load of insulin. And like you talked about extensively on your episode with Ben Bickman, insulin has hundreds, if not thousands of roles within the body. And when the body's exposed to it over long periods of time, it leads to disease, and it makes our body more insulin resistant, which makes our pancreas have to pump out more insulin at baseline. And so we get to this hyperinsulinemic state. So you want to avoid that by avoiding spikes, frequent spikes, and avoiding high spikes. And The second thing is that high glucose alone in its own right causes problem independent of insulin. So high glucose leads to inflammation. It leads to oxidative stress, so too many free radicals in the body, and it leads to glycation, which is glucose sticking to proteins and fats and other things in the body and causing dysfunction. So you want to avoid inflammation, oxidative stress, and glycation, and you want to avoid hyperinsulinemia. And so for all those reasons, I think really shooting for much more rolling hills on the glucose and not peaks and valleys. And then two other small things I will say is that when you do spike your glucose very, very high and have this big insulin surge, the body essentially is sucking all that glucose up really fast because you have all this insulin. And you often see this sharp spike and a big drop. And sometimes you can overshoot on the drop and you'll actually go lower than what you started at. And that's called reactive hypoglycemia. It's an overcompensation of insulin to a high spike. And that state, that reactive hypoglycemia, is often associated with brain fog, fatigue, anxiety, and sort of that post-meal like energy slump that a lot of people feel. And so, if you're experiencing a lot of variability throughout your day in your sort of mood, your energy, your focus, I think it'd be really the lowest hanging fruit I would look at is whether you're spiking and crashing all the time. And you can really avoid that by making these much more gentle rises and falls. And what's cool is that there's so much that we can do in terms of modulating our diet and lifestyle to achieve more gentle rises and fall. It doesn't necessarily mean eliminating all your favorite foods. It means pairing foods appropriately, timing foods appropriately, pairing foods with exercise in the right way, making sure we're not eating in a super stressed out state, and making sure we're getting really good sleep. All those things feed into our glucose response. So we can really artfully modulate the diet to get lower spikes. And that's essentially what my company, the software we've developed, helps people do, is learn how to do that. So
yeah, the software is awesome because you could put the range of where you want your glucose to be. You want that targeted range, I think you call it. So I actually put that for myself, 70 to 120. So I'm glad that's what you recommended because that's exactly what I put for my range. And there's some questions in the chat box here. I know that we booked an hour. Do you have an additional 10 minutes or do you have okay,
yes.
Cool. Thank you. So I want to first ask you, where can we get a CGM? You said right now it's just for type 1 and type 2 diabetics and it's not really outside of that. So how can we get our hands on one of these?
Yeah. So at this point, a lot of primary care doctors aren't really familiar with this use case of sort of health optimization and performance optimization and dietary personalization with a CGM. And so if an average person who does not have diabetes walks in and talks to their doctor might just be like, no, this is not for you. This is for people with diabetes. And so something that we did early on in our company was we set up a telemedicine physician network of partner physicians who, when you essentially become a Levels customer, you get a telemedicine consultation with a physician in your state, which is all done over the internet, and they evaluate you to make sure that you are safe to use a CGM. And if they do, and they do write a prescription for a continuous glucose monitor, that's sent to our partner pharmacy, which fulfills the prescription for these sensors and sends them to our customer's house. So they end up getting a box with two 14-day continuous glucose monitors. So the two sensors together make up a 28-day program, which we call our metabolic awareness program. And then onboarding instructions of how to get access to the app, which essentially takes this data stream and helps people really parse out all these different drivers of glycemic function and how to modulate and understand the diet and lifestyle factors to create really optimal glucose responses. So that's something that we provide as a company, is this access to a telemedicine network for continuous glucose monitor prescriptions.
So I know you have a waiting list right now. So where can they go and apply and get added to that waiting list so they could get one of these eventually?
Yeah. So we are an early company. We've been around for about a year. We are pre-full launch since we're in a closed beta program. So right now the best thing to do is to go to our website, which is levelshealth.com, and sign up for the wait list. And we're moving through this group of people, trying to get access as quickly as possible we can for everyone, and anticipate a full launch later this year.
And I was going to say, so I'm putting this in the chat box for the Keto Camp Academy members watching, Levels Health, Levels plural, health.com. I was going to say that, if you're concerned about the method of applying the CGM, from my experience, I wasn't sure what I was going to feel. I saw some videos, like my friend Mike Mutzel had a video, and he said he felt like a pinch when he put it on. So I was expecting a pinch, but honestly, I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel anything when I put it on. I was actually surprised that it was on me. I just pressed it on there. It's very easy to do, and I didn't feel anything. And I have it right here. And as you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, you have this little cool tape. I don't know if you want to call it a tape, but it's a cool branding thing you have on there, and it really covers it so you don't rip it off like I accidentally did the first time. So I learned from my mistake, and it's been on there working really well. Tamika Terry wants to know if you'll be able to purchase this with your FSA card. I don't know what that is. Do you know what that is, Casey?
Yeah, it's like a health savings account, essentially pre-tax money. And those funds are eligible to buy the product.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Again, that's levelshealth.com. We're going to put that in the notes of this podcast and the YouTube video down below. Amanda out in the UK says, so if your blood sugar has dropped, I'm actually put this on the screen here so you see it. So if your blood sugar has dropped after eating or drinking, does that suggest what you consumed raise your insulin?
It's a great question. That is one possibility. There's a couple other possibilities that are worth noting. So, it a little bit it depends on what you've done recently from a physical activity perspective. Because if you're eating something low carb and your muscles are particularly sensitized right then to take up glucose, you could just be actually taking up glucose into your muscles and seeing a drop in circulating glucose. And while you're eating, you're not necessarily getting any. If you're eating like a very low carb meal, not actually replacing that glucose. So it could have to do with physical activity. There's a couple other interesting scenarios. One is with alcohol. So alcohol often makes people's glucose levels lower as well, and that's independent of insulin. So people will often find if they have like a glass of red wine with a dinner that usually causes a blood glucose rise, it will actually cause less of a blood glucose rise. But that's from a totally different mechanism. And that happens because alcohol inhibits the part of the liver that essentially makes new glucose. There's a process called gluconeogenesis, which is where you make glucose from other substrates in the body. And that's one mechanism our body has to just make sure that we always have some glucose in the blood, because we would die if we didn't have any glucose in the blood. Your body keeps things really tight and has a lot of redundant pathways, and gluconeogenesis is one of them. And alcohol blocks that. So let's say you eat a totally, no carb meal and you have alcohol, you could very well see your glucose drop, because this little faucet that's always going to sort of like replace some glucose in the bloodstream has been impaired. So it's something that actually people who are on a keto diet who are fasting really need to be careful of. You do not want to be drinking alcohol when you're on an extended fast or, super in ketosis, because you may block one of the only pathways you have at that point towards replenishing glucose in the blood. So there have been reports of people, having comas and things like that because of drinking in a fasted state. So something important to think about. So there's a lot of different variables. And then I think one worth mentioning is that this could also just be from sensor error. So these are technologies that do the very accurate technology. I mean, it's used for medication dosing in people with diabetes, and it's a life-saving, device. And so it's very, very accurate. But there are, differences between what you pick up on your sensor and what might be in the blood. Very small differences, but it could be possible that you're picking up some of that, variability in the sensor. And at lower values, these sensors actually tend to be a little bit less accurate. And that is probably because there's less concentration of glucose in the blood at lower values. And so the enzyme on the little sensor that's actually measuring glucose has less to kind of work with. And so the sensors are getting more and more accurate at lower values as time goes on. But just another thing like worth mentioning, that it may be physiology, but it may also be, the hardware itself. And so if you're ever worried about low glucose, I think it's always good to finger prick and just sort of like double check if you're super concerned about that. So
great answer. When do you think there's going to be a continuous ketone monitor?
Man, I'm waiting. I am very excited. There are a lot of really smart groups out there who are working on multi-analyte sensors. And I think that's really That is the future. Being able to know your ketones in relation to your glucose, and then one day maybe a continuous insulin sensor.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait.
Yeah, I think this is. I think that a continuous glucose monitor gets us at least 75% of the way there. But having some of those other analytes would be fantastic. Having continuous inflammation monitoring and things like that. But the ketone thing is great because ultimately, one of the big goals of using a technology like this is that if I can keep my glucose spikes low, I can assume that I'm keeping my insulin exposure low and I am regaining insulin sensitivity. Each day that I put in reps to keep my glucose stable, I am essentially building insulin sensitivity. And I'm also keeping my insulin exposure low, which means, and I know your keto camp people know this, and you talk about this a lot on different podcasts, but insulin for fat to be used as fuel in the body and for us to use fat as an energy source and be metabolically flexible, insulin has to be low. And as you use those fat burning pathways more and more, they get stronger and you become more efficient at using them. And so I really like to think of this as like, by having good days on CGM, it's just like working out. You are getting reps in to build your metabolic fitness. And when you're building your metabolic fitness, it means that you're keeping your insulin stable and you are tapping into fat burning pathways more effectively. And then in different times of energy substrate availability, like a fasted state, or you're exercising in a, low glucose environment, or, you are doing keto, that you're going to be able to flip flop back and forth between burning glucose and burning fat. And the average person walking around in the United States, I don't think has the capability of doing that very efficiently, because we have been so exposed to such readily accessible food sources that spike glucose, refined carbohydrates, refined sugar at just astronomical levels in our foods, that we haven't really needed to tap into our fat burning sources, because insulin is always there to basically utilize glucose for fuel. So it's a fun way to kind of get your reps in, and every day, you get a kind of green circle on our app is like a day that you can kind of assume that you have, put in a good metabolic flexibility rep. So
that's awesome. Yeah. So if you're somebody who gets really inspired and motivated by those numbers, this could be something that's really, really cool tool to hold you accountable. So Catherine wants to know if insurance covers if you're not diabetic or pre-diabetic.
Right now, it doesn't. Yeah. So insurance does not cover this for off-label uses, which is really unfortunate. A big part of our effort moving forward is clinical research that's going to hopefully show the efficacy of this for a non-diabetic population, and also that this is a really cost-effective tool for keeping people healthy. So our mission is to reverse the trend of metabolic dysfunction in the United States. And part of that is going to be producing the research that shows that this is effective. And ultimately, as we move towards more of a value-based care in our healthcare system, where we're incentivized to keep people healthy, I think this is going to emerge as a really big tool, but it's going to take research and cost efficacy data showing that for payers to really understand the value of this. So it's very much on our roadmap to help move that ball forward so that everyone can have access to this. At the current price point of buying it out of the pocket, it's not accessible to everyone, but it should be. And our goal is to make it get to a price point where it can be.
Yeah. So Catherine, they're working on it right now. The answer is no, but that's subject to change. David, who is he's an amazing member here. He's type 1 diabetic. Here's what he wrote. After becoming fat adapted, I no longer have convulsions associated with extreme lows. I now find that a blood sugar of 45 to 60 seems okay. Is it better for ketosis and A1C to operate at these levels, or would be lowering basal insulin be better? Is there an optimal blood sugar and or basal rate?
Oof, great question, David. And also, congratulations on your journey and, gaining fat adaptation capabilities. And, I am going to defer on this one because I think this is getting very much into the realm of medical, and it would probably be a better question for chatting offline with your doctor. But I will say it is not well known whether living at a blood glucose of 45 to 60 is optimal for health. as far as I know, that I don't have an answer to that question. And that's a question that I want answered, because we see a lot of people, including myself, going into the 50s and 60s, not infrequently. And I don't have a clear answer on whether that is safe or healthy. But we do know from large population studies that many, many healthy individuals wearing CGM will drop into the 50s and 60s during a 24-hour period. That's actually totally normal on CGM. But what the health outcomes of that are, it is not known. So, and I think it makes sense because, non-diabetic individuals or lower glucose values have not been studied as much because they're not necessarily considered pathologic. And we've been dealing more with the issue of high glucose. And so, yeah, ultimately don't have a clear answer for that.
Okay, I align with your answer, by the way. So, Dr. Casey, this has been such a fun, fascinating interview, and I can't wait to do it again and geek out some more because more things are going to arise and more questions will come from me. So we'll do this again. Where is the best place besides levelshealth.com if you want to get added to the wait list? Where else can I go check out some of your work?
Yeah, check out @UnlockLevels on Instagram and Twitter. And especially for the keto folks, check out levelshealth.com/blog, because we've had some people use CGM who we've interviewed for the blog and sort of showing how to use CGM to enhance keto and what I would call keto 2.0, which is glucose-informed keto diets. I think there's some really interesting stories on there of people following a strict keto diet who actually really liberalized their keto diet from using CGM and learning that certain foods that were off limits actually didn't spike their glucose or kick them out of ketosis. So check that out, levelshealth.com/blog, @UnlockLevels for Twitter and Instagram. And for me personally, you can find me at Dr. Casey's Kitchen on Twitter and Instagram. So Dr. Casey's Kitchen. And I'm actually vegan and fairly high carb in my diet. And so I write a lot about basically metabolic awareness and CGM results on a very, very personalized plant-based diet, and how I've used CGM to craft a plant-based high carb diet that essentially keeps my glucose completely flat all the time. And I think that's a whole area of the plant-based world and veganism that's going to be exciting. So vegan 2.0, of really shaping a plant-based diet that doesn't have the collateral damage of huge glucose spikes that I think that probably a lot of plant-based people are dealing with right now. So Dr. Casey's Kitchen, check it out, and would love to hear from you.
Yeah, so we'll put all the links and the resources that Dr. Casey just mentioned in the notes of the podcast and down below in the YouTube video. I love that, you said you're fairly high carb, but, you're about 100, you said 100 to 200 grams of carbs per day. That's in the standard American diet considered low carb, but to us, the keto folks, it's considered high carb. So let's put that in perspective. So,
yeah.
And you're doing it in a way that's very unique because you've tested which plant-based foods work with your physiology, like you said offline, versus which plant-based foods do not. Most vegans are not doing this. So you would have, if you could get on the Rich Roll podcast, that would be such a fascinating topic because you could definitely educate a lot of his listeners on how to do this the right way. I want to acknowledge you, Casey. Oh, did you want to say something?
No,
okay.
Just thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to acknowledge you and say I love your energy. You've got great energy. Your story is amazing because you went from the medical world, the conventional medical world, to thinking outside the box, and you're impacting a lot of lives. And I've been really fascinated with my CGM, and thank you so much for sending it my way. And I look forward to doing this again. The keto campers are saying, excellent. We live in an extraordinary time. I just signed up for your list. Thank you to both of you. They're showing some heart. So I'm grateful for your research and your energy, and I can't wait to do this again. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It was so fun to chat with you. And I am so grateful for the work you're doing too, to help people become healthy and creating such culture around it that's so positive and inspiring. And I just really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for having me on.
Let's keep changing the world. Thank you, Casey.